more informal. Um, so I'm just going to share my screen with a Word document of sort of notes that I made. And this is really just, this is not a, let's say, an academic presentation in any, but I thought I would just sort of sketch out a number of the things that came to mind in reading the PowerPoint and listening to the presentation from last time, and then we could sort of roll with it. And I liked the conversation that we were having in the email exchange about universals and particulars that was inspired by Professor King's comments last time. And so hopefully that can be a part of the conversation. I sort of circuitously landed there in this bullet list. But anyway, I wanted to sort of sketch out some things I thought might be interesting to consider. What I've done here is to sort of say a number of things that I think roughly sketch out the outlines of the tensions in ideas of learning and emulation in early China. And those tensions, I think, are almost irresolvable, but they point to a number of ethical and political and social, as Professor King rightly pointed out, about the distinctions between these. And so I just thought we could go through these. So I've sort of set them off as a series of, let's say, tension. So first, as Professor Nylan said in the presentation last week, that Xue somehow, or learning emulation somehow confers authority, but we're not exactly sure what that authority is, or what about Xue confers authority. But at the same time, in the spirit of epistemological modesty, that learning is about listening to authority. So one way of resolving this tension would be to say, well, once you've listened to authority long enough, you have become an authority. But I think that the early texts often don't take that tack. And so the role of the teacher is often, or the role of the model is often, someone who has submitted themselves to the authority of others, and by virtue of showing that they are living under authority, they themselves become an authority. So the sort of second part of this is that, rulers and parents and others have some kind of teaching role, but that teaching role, which is based on a kind of authority, is often not unambiguously I have authority and you don't, but rather that I model what good learning looks like. So there are a number of examples that one could point to, but the Li Ji has a really excellent example of the sort of teaching role of ritual. So in this particular, we could look at the whole text. I could bring it up if that becomes important, but the description that the Li Ji gives is that the ruler, by being in a position to receive teachings, actually models that he respects the authority above him, in this case, the authority of heaven, and that this has the payoff in politics, that he can rule without command, that the people are moved by the fact that he submits to authority, that they too submit to authority, as a way of, so the thing that's being emulated here is that he models what it's like to be a student, or to be a recipient of authoritative teachings, and then it's by him positioning himself in that position that he becomes a model for others. So this is sort of the second set of issues the second set of tensions, like what exactly is this teaching role? And we'll get to this question of jiaohua, hopefully at some point during the 2 hours. Like exactly what do we mean when we say that political power is somehow about jiaohua, or other forms of power about jiaohua, about teaching and transformation? Like how does that transformation happen? The other part of this that I thought would be interesting to sort of talk about is what the status of errors and criticism is in this society. So on the one hand, as the Analects and many other texts make clear, that rulers and parents commit errors, they can commit errors, they do commit errors, they will commit errors. And that not only is that going to happen, but also it's okay. And the Analects, the great line from the Analects is that the errors of the gentleman are like the eclipses of the sun and the moon. Everyone can see them. So there's a sense in which they should be seen by everyone, and that by being seen by everyone, they when you correct those errors, that the correction is also seen, and that makes it all the greater. So this is sort of the sixth point, that exposing oneself to criticism is a virtue, in the sense that it's fortunate to have folks around who point out when you make mistakes, and that you learn from that. Confucius has obviously a number of examples, and there are a number of examples in the Analects where Confucius says how fortunate I am to have folks around who will point out my errors. Incidentally, the newly published but unprovenance text from Aohui of Confucius sayings has a really great line about this problem of being fortunate to have people who correct your errors. And the line there is that Yanhui improves because people aren't careful around him, and they'll point out his errors because he's the kind of person who accepts criticism. Whereas Zigong is very unfortunate because he's the kind of person who everyone is careful around and will refuse to point out his errors. Which, it's interesting. Anyway, but on the other hand, so you should be exposed to criticism, and you should allow your errors to be visible. But on the other hand, it's the people who are criticizing you also have to have various considerations of tact. So you see this in the Mencius account of parents and teachers, fathers and sons, especially fathers teaching sons, that somehow when you criticize a son criticizing a father, this hurts the relationship. Presumably there, as the Zhuangzi points out at the beginning of the Jian Shi chapter, that when the ruler is criticized, that sometimes this doesn't work out well because there's a question of the art of doing criticism. So I've been thinking about this last question a lot, and I wanted to put it on the table because I think it sort of brings together some of the things that are happening in the previous sets of tensions, which is that it seems clear that in these early texts that you don't have to be a perfect model to be a teacher. But there is a sense in which there's also the well-formulated argument in early texts that somehow the teacher or the ruler or the parent has to model good behavior. And so there's sort of a tension here between, where is the locus of authority if the person who is the authority doesn't live up to their professed teachings. And this, I think, gets into something similar to the question of universals and particulars that we were talking about sort of in the email exchange. Namely, because one way of resolving this would be to say, well, it's not the person that is necessarily always the model. That sometimes the person who is imperfect can have a teaching that is perfect, and that can stand even when the person doesn't live up to that teaching. So, the sort of two Koke arguments that, you say that, but you don't actually live up to that, doesn't actually refute the importance of the teaching. It just merely says, well, the person doesn't live up to it in a particular context. So anyway, that's a lot of things that we can sort of juggle around, but I wanted to sort of, I guess the opening question would be, how do we think about the meaning of 教化 in a context where rulers can be imperfect, but they also have the role of modeling and transforming the population or their family members as a key part of their role as an authority. Yeah.
Is that a question? I think that's a question aimed to all of us.
Yeah,
correct?
I mean, I don't know what the format is, but I think that like we're sort of open to just sort of exploring together. But, so
as a universal rule, I'd like to get rid of the tension. Yeah. You often like to frame things in terms of tensions, and I get that. And Benjamin Schwartz did that a lot, and I think that's in our field. But I would say, first of all, by pointing out the role of rulers and parents, you've forgotten that according to the Analects, everyone is a teacher. And they're teaching you what to do or what not to do, because you look at it and you go, oh, wow, that's impressive. Or, oh, wow, I would really prefer not to be doing that. Okay. So first of all, I think you've already skewed the arguments a bit in ways that I think don't always suit the early period. And even if we're confining our remarks to sayings ascribed to Confucius or anecdotes about Confucius. Second of all, I think if my first response would be not that rulers and parents can commit errors, they will commit errors. And so people have to be very clear about what they owe in terms of an obligation to the time and effort that authority figures have put into our formation. Versus there is no obligation to obey. So let me take the end of the Xiaojing, which is all about your chief duty to your superiors is to remonstrate with them because you have their long-term interests in mind rather than their short-term, I want you to do X in mind. So if we don't put time in this picture, we've lost the whole point of nearly all of the discourse. And I see no time in your picture. Number 8, I guess, criticizing others requires consideration of tact. Yes, how do you formulate the most effective criticism? Well, we do that every day. If we wish to be effective teachers of anybody, including the cat, we need to figure out how we're going to best train the people we're trying to train. So there are moments when you mention things, there are moments when you don't mention things. You try to figure out what would a path look like to greater maturity. And then, of course, you don't give them step 5 admonitions at step 1. You hold off. And of course, the tradition ascribed to Confucius in the Analects is perfectly illustrates that from book 1 on, because it makes a point of the fact that Confucius doesn't answer disciples in the same way, but he answers them according to where he sees they need a bit of strengthening before they can get to the next step. So I would say that the key thing in the early texts, and I would clearly draw a line between this and later Neo-Confucian teachings, especially those following the Jushi model. Teachings never are perfect. The classics, it's said about the classics in my period, none of them are perfect. That is why they need different readings to be instantiated at court. They are the work of human beings, not the work of gods. And yet, knowing those teachings can play an enormous role in how one goes about making decisions in real life. So I don't see any tensions here other than the ordinary thinking about, well, what is this person ready for? Okay, I don't teach my undergraduates the same way I teach my graduate students. I don't say the same things to graduate students right before their qualifying exams as I might say a year or two on. And so here it is. I think all of us who hope to be good teachers try very hard to think about the situation at hand and what can and cannot be said in that situation if we hope to deliver the message effectively. So I'll just end with Jiaohua. We have a very strong notion about what Jiaohua is, and I think most of us were taught that by our teachers, and most of us thought it was leading to unity. In fact, Jiaohua and political unity, Tongyi, are put together in a lot of modern writings, okay? Michael Lowy, my teacher, pointed out, and Michael Mann, the sociologist, gave good reasons. My teacher never read Michael Mann, but they're on the same wavelength, that no one in the early period is aiming for ideological unity because that's just not possible in the world that we're in. So what does Jiaohua mean? Well, interestingly, it means something pretty much like paideia, I would say, in the early Greek text. It means, first of all, you know what are the proper practices of marriage and mourning. You don't sacrifice young women of prominent families to be the daughters of the Yellow River god. But beyond that, what it means is teaching people how they can identify themselves as constructive members of the community. And it's a pretty low level. I went through every instance of Jiaohua, and it's a pretty low level requirement, as it were. Because there are different levels of Jiaohua meant for different populations in the early period. So what Jiaohua might mean in an outlying area is quite different from what Jiaohua appears to mean when the object of Jiaohua is members of the court. Okay. So again, I would say we all take this word to mean something like socialized or civilized or unified. And for me, that's way too strong of a translation. If I were gonna say what I think Jiaohua, luckily I can use a whole sentence to do so in this setting, but maybe not in a translation. And it means bringing people into the basic norms of the community so that they can communicate well with each other in certain ways. So anyway, those are just my first responses, and I'm sure Richard has lots of things to say here.
Trenton, do you want to react to your correction?
I suppose I could say one thing. I think that no, I think it's really good. Especially the issue of everyone being a teacher in some sense. I find this actually a quite inspiring way of envisioning one of the radical, even political implications of the early texts. Not to do the thing that Michael is probably going to yell at me for nicely again. But there's, you know, in my favorite, in one of my favorite texts, namely the writings of Wang Bi on the Lao Tzu, he makes this argument using I think some version of the, or maybe inspired by some version of the Analects, where he says, you know, I don't actually teach anything. You know, he's sort of riffing on Lao Tzu this way. I don't teach anything. I teach the thing that everyone teaches, namely that, you know, that there is that the way that human community exists is already sort of self-correcting, because there is all of this mutual learning and teaching going on. Now, the radical implication of that is, well, you know, if that's the model, if that's an ideal model of human community or political community even, then what are we talking about when we talk about rulers and subjects? What are we talking about? Like, where does that fit into? Are there some people who are more teachers than others? I mean, would be one way of asking that. But it's not clear how to define that, as, you know, you know, everyone's a teacher, but there are some teachers who are more teachers than like, is that the way that we should take these texts, or should we actually, you know, say that, you know, ideally we could live without authority because everyone is an authority?
No, I think that's the wrong implication. And let me jump in here, just because here we're having a conversation as a teacher and a former student, now a colleague. I just wanted to say, because people won't know why you're saying I'm going to yell at you, that I said you need to put your cell phone on and set up your voicemail for your child. Okay, so that's the extent of my yelling. So you have, I think we need to put that on the background here. I would take Wang Bi as saying, not that we are self-correcting, would that we were self-correcting. I don't see anybody saying that human beings don't have an extremely hard time correcting themselves. So I believe that what Wang Bi is saying is something very similar, and you know Wang Bi much better than I do, but something very similar to what Xunzi says, is that we're all human portents. We send out messages of who we are, whether we mean to be doing so or not. And those messages are rather easily read. And I think that's a presumption in the early period. And actually, it's my presumption too. That it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out, after watching someone's conduct with only half attention, but more than once, you see how they operate among other people. And so I think this is such a basic fundamental assumption that human beings in their speech and in their conduct do show themselves to be good or bad teachers. And I'll just give a brief anecdote myself. When I was trying to figure out whether I could ever be an anecdote, I made the mistake, sorry, not an anecdote, trying to figure out whether I could be possibly a professional teacher. I made the mistake of going to an Association for Asian Studies meeting. And around all the famous teachers, there were what I would call anointed men, acolytes, waiting in the wings for the attention of these famous men. And I thought to myself, first of all, I can't be an acolyte. It's not in my nature. And second of all, I wouldn't want there to be these clusters of people around me. I'm very mindful of the wonderful story in Zhuangzi, where Zhuangzi, I think it's Zhuangzi, but maybe I've got the character wrong, but somebody leaves the funeral having taken great care to get to the funeral of the person he regards as master, by saying, who are all these people? He must have done something to get all these people to come to the funeral, to get all of this happening. I think that on both sides, we reveal who we are in what we revere and whom we're trying to emulate. But beating one's chest about it is rarely the right way to proceed. Sorry, Richard, you're way overdue for a discussion.
Not at all, not at all. In fact, I think what I want to draw attention to is, in a sense, it runs counter to some of those remarks, but also to the remarks that we are all teachers. So one of the striking things I think is about the teacher-student relation or teacher-pupil relation is that there is an up and down, there is hierarchy. And I think this is one of the really interesting things about it, not only about teaching, but about all relationships in the kind of texts we're thinking about, and the way in which this hierarchy works and in which hierarchies can be reversed in different contexts. What I'm thinking of course, is rulers who in fact are theoretically above some teacher, but actually in practice, the teacher will be teaching the ruler. And of course, the real question at the back of all that is, where does hierarchy come from?
Well, and in the Han text,
that wasn't a question.
Yes, but I know it wasn't a question, but I'm going to take it as a question or as something that requires comments. In the Bohutong, the ruler must, as a servant, and he shows that by rolling up his sleeves, serve the teacher, not on every occasion, but he must publicly, in the sense of to all the assembled at a major event, serve his tutors publicly. And so there's also the model very strong in Zhangguo, and I would say very strong among some rulers in Han, that one's advisors are one's intimate friends. So the hierarchy can also collapse. All complex societies, as far as I know, and here I'm coming very close to a universal, but I said as far as I know, have hierarchies. They need them. Okay, someone makes pots, someone's rules, that's a profession. Other people are ruled and doing other jobs in the society. So I think our problem as Westerners is we get stuck on the word hierarchy and tend to ascribe it to early societies as if they were more hierarchical. Well, I wish you would come to Berkeley, California, Richard, which has such an extreme hierarchy that as a professor in the social sciences, it is a rare event for me to be able to speak to the dean of the social sciences. So there is a hierarchy. I have to go through my chair, and if I'm complaining about my chair, it's very unclear how I'm supposed to communicate that there's a problem. So I think we ignore the hierarchy in our own lives. Of course there's hierarchy, of course. In the village, the village elders are often the highest authority over other people in one's family, and they are the face of the ruler. So I take hierarchy for granted because I don't know of a single society where hierarchy doesn't exist and where people aren't experientially very conscious of that hierarchy. So yeah.
Yes, I mean, I'm not by any means denying the universal, but I'm I'm drawing attention to this particular case, and I think it's very important. And it's also very important the way it is explained, as I think it is, as being the origin of order. This is basically what order means, is that there is a top and a bottom.
Right.
And
But
this is, sorry, just finish my sentence. I mean, this is the important, I mean, it's the word authority that is really difficult in, I think, what Fenton is, what on earth is authority? And there's a kind of obedience in there, and there's a kind of listening to and observing of duties towards, and that is, as it were, a core of order, is the way I would look at it. And this means, I mean, there is something very strange about talking about teaching here, I find, because I don't think that this is, at least in the current way we teach, which has a lot to do with what you call the message, I think, Michael, rather than formation of individuals in roles.
I'm going to set aside the way we teach,
Yeah.
because that's a very complicated thing, and we may not be teaching the same in Switzerland as we're teaching in Berkeley, California. Although I think we're probably closer than mostly we think of. I wanted to get back to the basis of order. Shunza makes this point very plain, that of course people have different roles, and that if we're talking about how to make a pot, the potter has the greatest authority because the greatest technical command. But I would also like to say, and I've been very impressed with this fact, that when you're a diviner, to get it 70% right is regarded as good as it gets. And when you're a doctor, an imperial physician, the same figure is stipulated to get it 70%. In other words, the realm left for the unknowable is much larger than we would like to leave it today. I'm not sure I want to go to a doctor whom I think has, well, a 70% batting average, okay? I'd like to think he has a higher batting average in curing things for me. So I think as human beings, we all know that there are many different kinds of authorities in our lives. The question is which ones should take the lead in which situations. So if you want to make money, then there are a number of people you should take as your model, although most of the phenomenally rich people were privileged to begin with. So starting from the bottom in that way is not going to get you probably phenomenal wealth. If you wish to get a reputation, there may be other people whom you take as your model, or even take as your the wrong model to emulate. Okay. But I think each of us, as we're thinking, well, whom do we want to be? And seeking teachers who might help us become that person, are very aware that we get X from this person and Y from this person. So I've been struck by the fact that there is no classical master to whom I can point in the early period who isn't known to have teachers who were not classical masters. So a sword master or a legal expert or an administrative. So I think academia is a bit strange as a model because it leaves us a very confined field from which to choose our models. But most people seeking authority in the early period assume that they need to have authoritative insight, often technical knowledge of X, Y, and Z fields. Okay. So the closest I could come to that would be that I studied with a historian of science, and he taught me astronomy, medicine, and some other technical arts. That wasn't normal for somebody who wants to go into academia, that you go so far out of a designated space, but it was normal for me because what I wanted to do was gather teachers who knew the things the people I was studying knew. Okay. So that made it much more complicated. And it's probably the reason why I could never go to a philosophy department, because I would not then have learned about the things that my people knew, how to use history and arguments, how to construct stories that mean something to someone. Okay, those are typically history people who take on those issues. Yeah. So anyway.
I had a comment that relates not to hierarchies or to this, but to the discussion a little bit earlier and last week. So we used the word perfect many times. And everyone did. No, everyone did.
Then for me, it would have been not perfect, but that's all right.
So yeah, this is just like throwing this out for discussion, right? So and this is also related to the discussion of universals, right? I think in various different ways, right? But of course, I mean, I can just take this sort of mundane example, right? Like in English, when we say perfect, we mean something basically otherworldly, depending on how you want to understand that, right? But we mean something that's really you know, it fits all cases, something like this. But of course, you can have other understandings of perfect, right? For example, in modern Chinese, you can say like 很完美, or like 这个比那个还完美, right? Like, so things can be like more perfect, right? Or this is perfect, but this one is even more perfect than that one, right? So you have a notion, maybe something like, you know, that it fits the context well, like the, you know, it has timing in it, it has circumstance, all these other things. So you can have different understandings of perfect, right? And I think that that can really inform and change the discussion in a lot of ways. And that's also there, I think, even, for example, Trenton, in your handout, when Michael Nylan pointed to can should be will, right? Like that parents or teachers can make mistakes versus they will make mistakes, right? I think there's a little bit of that reflection there. And I think it should have, because this morning when you were talking about that, Trenton, I was thinking about a lot about like, what does criticism mean in this early context, right? Like, I'm not sure, and I'm not trying to sound like, oh, you know, everything's so new to me, but really, like, I'm not that sure I know exactly what it means, right? Because it's, and so I'm sort of asking, because criticism today is often something, you know, just like pointing out this part of whatever, but the way that you're talking about it, Trenton, and the way that I was thinking about it was more like collaborative interaction, you know what I mean? That there's a little more give and take in there. And so, yeah, I'm just wondering about like, yeah, this understanding of perfect and how this is related to criticism and, you know, anything basically that we've been talking about. So, and then of course, yeah, what does criticism really mean in this context, right? And how might it be different than from the way that we generally tend to think about it? Or maybe it's fairly similar, which is also fine.
I'm assuming Trenton wants to answer that.
Okay,
But
I just make it.
Okay, I'm gonna let him think. I would never translate Wan Mei as perfectly beautiful. And I would point out that Hannah Arendt says that there are two kinds of judgments. One is aesthetic and one is liable to testing. So if I say, this is fully beautiful, or arresting or compelling, I'm not really asking you in the same way, can I test this sense of beauty? So I think it's incredibly important that in the phrase Xing when people translate it as human nature is evil, no, the commentators say that means bumei. It is not beautiful to behold. And every commentator in the early period takes it that way. So we are talking about the aesthetic appeal, and it doesn't have to mean that it's because they adhere to conventional standards of Hollywood beauty. How beautiful it is to watch someone act in a way that we would call maybe edifying. And we've all seen it, where someone acts in a way and you go, yes, okay. And yet it's not liable to testing, it's not liable to this, it is an aesthetic judgment in a sense, as so many of our judgments are. And what I would have taken to be impressive as a 2-year-old won't be the same as a 15-year-old, won't be the same as a 30-year-old, won't be the same as I am now. So those are not testable. And I think we need to know in human experience that there's a huge range of things that are mysterious and a huge range of things that are aesthetic judgments. I find this pleasing.
Yeah, there's another sort of related thing that you were bringing up, Michael, which I think is also like opens up like xue and emulation and criticism, which is with the 70%, for example, right? So like you definitely wouldn't go in for a surgery where they said there's 70%. And there's this idea, I think, like we're very much interested in controllability and predictability, right? That's also somewhat related to, I think, a notion of perfect, right? And which doesn't have to be that notion, right? But I'm just talking about thinking patterns, right? That like revolve in this way, right? And you can have thinking patterns that work in a different way. And my assumption is that when we're talking about xue and criticism and emulation and authority even, right? And teachers, that we're talking about, we're less, not even that we're less sure about things, but we're even less, we're willing to be less sure, right? I think that's the major difference, right? We're willing to be okay with 70%.
Okay, so you bring up something that I think we're all interested in. What makes for collaboration? And it is, of course, trust. Okay. I am collaborating with people whom I think, no, I'm not exactly like them. No, we may disagree on X, Y, and Z, but we can collaborate towards a single goal. Okay. And then sometimes the collaboration breaks down. I think that one of the things, and for this I thank Trenton. It was in a seminar 3 years ago when Trenton said, look, it's all about Xinwei. It's all about trust and authority. And I went, what do you mean it's all about trust and authority? And we were working on a passage from the documents. It wasn't obviously about trust and authority at that particular point. But I do believe that when you have, when we are in manuscript culture and you are writing things, compiling things, actually, not writing de novo things from previous things, and the members of the governing elite are doing this for other members of the governing elite, then the chief message would be, in order to collaborate well with people whose number you either hope to join or have already joined, it is getting you to look at what is important in those relations. And I would say it is all about trust and all about authority. In other words, I don't trust, I'm very sensitive to bullies. I don't deal well with them myself. So there are different kinds of authority for me that don't require bullying, because as soon as they bully not only me, but somebody else in my sight, I don't trust them anymore to be useful partners in future collaboration. And so then much of the early writing is about being in these positions. Well, what happens if you were in a group and now you're not so sure you trust the members of the group going forward? And what happens so that you don't get yourself into a head where you think you're infallible? What happens when X, Y, and Z? So I do think it all goes back to trust and authority, and asks us to think hard about what are the qualities we're looking for in someone we give trust to and give authority to. There was a wonderful New York Times, and then I'll shut up, saying, don't drink your own Kool-Aid. Okay. And it was talking about Putin. He seems to have believed all of the things that his propaganda told him was true of him, that he was infallible, that, you know, he knew what was best for the Russian people. And it's a real point for people who are trying to act in political ways, i.e. ways that disadvantage some and advantage others perforce, how you will proceed. And if you acquire some authority, how you'll be careful not to drink your own Kool-Aid.
Can I push in a slightly different direction here, away from the personal to the institutional? Because I mean, schools, whatever we're going to call them, are institutions, and I think that a lot of the texts are concerned with, if not establishing institutions, then describing the way they should be. And I mean, one I've been working on is the is chapter 9 of the Xunzi, the Wangzhi, the royal regulations, as I call them, where there is, towards the end, there is a list of the different guan, the different offices. The reason I'm mentioning this is that there are two places where Jiaohua appears, one on the village level, where interestingly you teach Xiaoti, and one on the court level, where the sovereign, in fact, is responsible for Jiaohua. And this is clearly something which is meant to, let's say, transcend the people actually performing these roles and to be institutionalized impersonally, I would think.
Yes, you and I are both fans of that chapter, and there's a chapter in the Documents Classic that's basically a list of offices as well, and in some respects seems out of place in the documents, which is mostly speeches between advisors and rulers, where the advisors, by the way, are taking the chief role. What I would say about this is that anybody who works in any institution knows that there have to be divisions of labor that don't give too much responsibility to one person. And what I mean by that, I don't mean it cynically. I mean, so the person can actually fulfill the duty So there's also people, I can mean it cynically. But one of the definitions of Ren in the early texts, we all know the definitions about being fully mature and compassionate and all of that. But in the Han Dynasty, a lot of passages on Ren are, do not ask people to undertake tasks of which they are not at this moment capable. So don't give people this burden that they're not ready to fulfill. So we know that one of the facts of early Chinese empires, which is not a fact of the Roman Empire until the Byzantine period, so Roman Empire in decline, is that we often have child emperors. So saying the emperor is responsible means the emperor's court or the responsible person, the person who has sovereignty. And I wouldn't say I just said it, but I don't mean the person. I mean the group of advisors around there who are in the top positions, the ministers, the chancellor, the assistant, the regent often. There's usually more than one regent. They must confer. So I think Jun is a placeholder here for an authoritative person. And even at the village level, you can call somebody a Jun in the newly excavated documents. It simply means the person who's responsible and on the village level, okay? And they can be addressed that way. So again, I think we're thinking so narrowly about terms that have a wider range of meaning than we typically give them. And that's certainly true of Ren and Min. And that's also been borne out in some of the newly excavated documents, but pre-unification documents as well. Thomas Krohn and other Japanese scholars worked on these meanings. And so if we take a Mencius quote that says, all people have X heart, okay? Are we talking about every single person, or are we talking about those among the king's men, the king's people? And really, I think we have to look at each and every passage quite carefully to do that. So,
yes. Yeah. I mean, I agree entirely about that. The Mencius passage, which you may be thinking about. Namely that all Ren have a Bu Ren Jishin, and it's very much the question who is being talked about there.
Right.
Absolutely, yeah.
If I could jump back in on the earlier bit about perfection, because I think there's an issue about this sort of as a problem of the art of ruling, like even when we consider the types of institutional fixtures of the time, that there is still sort of a artistry to inhabiting those fixtures.
Absolutely.
And part of this goes back to one of the things that that Paul was raising about perfection and criticism. I think, or at least I'm going to pretend that it's about this, which is so the answer to the very specific question that Paul asked, the word that I had in mind when I was when I wrote criticism was the word zilla. So to demand, or to, even to, in the sense of demand repayment, but the sort of demanding accusation. And in early Chinese context, this is often paired with a term that means something like, or at least is in the orbit of the word perfection, namely bei. So to be completely, to somehow be complete, to have all of the components. And,
I'm sorry, what was the word?
Hey, sorry, let me just open my thing back up so we're all on the same.
Since we're talking about it, okay.
So bei, so bei, qiu bei.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay,
demanding,
Right.
demanding, and one of the, so I think this is the passage that Professor Nylan is just talking about from the Analects,
could you just write it anyways for people who
It's on the share screen.
okay,
yeah. So meaning to like accuse or to blame or to demand, but bei to mean to demand. So here to demand completeness.
Mm.
And one of the things that you see often in early texts is sort of trying to hold. So to demand completeness is often a negative thing. I would say 90% of the time is a negative thing, especially when you're demanding it of others, because there's a sense in which that demand for perfection actually impedes the relationship, and there's also a sense in which like it misplaces where the duty lies. So for instance, in the passage that from Wang Zhi from Xunzi that Professor King was just talking about, before Jiaohua is the question of zheng shen xing. So you correct your own behavior. And so often you'll see in these contexts that you shouldn't obey, you shouldn't demand perfection from others, you should correct your own behavior. I mean, even Dong Zhongshu will make this as sort of a play on words, where he'll say, the difference between Ren and Yi is that Ren is directed towards others, and Yi, because it is a war, is directed to the self. So you demand perfection of the self and not of others, as a way of proceeding with your,
Sorry, where does Dong Zhongshu say that?
I'm getting sloppy because
you are getting sloppy, aren't you?
There's all sorts of discussions about whether any of this stuff is written by Dong Zhongshu. But in any case, in the Chunqiu Fanlu, there is the
almost certainly not.
So there's this text in the Chunqiu Fanlu, the Ren Fa, and he makes this claim.
Right.
Anyway. But that's sort of taking us for a field.
But I wouldn't say war is the self. War in early China is usually those of us at court acting on behalf. So I would have to, and I haven't read this passage, okay? So I would want to see all kinds of comments on it. But war so seldom means the self in the early period. It means people in our small group. I would even, my first response is, boy, I need to go in and read this whole passage. Okay, it's not good enough to flip it on us. But your translation, according to Huan Kan, I think has a problem. Okay. I don't think he's saying that it's by type. Dang doesn't mean type in the early period. It means so often our faults are of a piece because that's the way in our small group of people, the way we do things. Okay, so one can be, I think he's asking for tolerance from the fact that as everyone agrees in the early period whom I've read, that we grow to be quite different according to our upbringing. And so we need to be tolerant depending on the way we've been brought up. Richard and I were having a conversation earlier about our respective upbringings. I saw a chat, but I can't answer it right away. But if somebody wants to raise a hand, I could try to answer it.
So Joseph Merce says in the chat, sorry to bother everyone. Does anyone know what the newly excavated texts are that the professors are discussing?
I can tell you, I've been working on local community And so and this is thanks to Trenton, by the way. We did a paper together on daring, and he wanted to bring these new texts in. So I said, oh, hell, there's a lot of stuff I need to now acquaint myself with. So what I'm looking at is text from Li Ye, from the New Juyen. I'm also looking at going back to the Yinhuan documents, and soon I'll be looking at Jingzhou. In this melange of people, a melange of texts and people behind them, I'm finding something very similar to what Trenton was bringing to my attention, which that in order to be courteous to people in letters or in documents, one is often addressing someone as Jun, who is certainly not the ruler. Okay, so it would be something like my lord, or I'm addressing you as sir, to show my respect for you. That's what I was talking about in the newly excavated documents. Thanks. Thanks, Trenton. You're so much better at this than I am. So much quicker. Okay. We were going to talk about universals. Yeah. And I wanted to begin the discussion by saying that, and really I want to hear what Richard has to say here. One of my guidelines was enunciated by John Maynard Keynes. And as people may or may not know, he was one of the great economic historians and economists, theoretical of the 20th century. And what he said in response to something was, I would rather be imprecisely right than precisely wrong. And he was talking about even dealing with statistics and quantification. And so one of my complaints about dealing with universals is the history of people who want to traffic in universals. It's a colonial history. It's identifying who's civilized and who's barbarian. But it's also, and it's a very male claim from Kant, and I won't go into the things that Kant said about female powers of reasoning. But it has also led in philosophy to the reification of numerical quantification and numerical logic. So one of the things I've been made of quite recently is because I've been reading the books on the women at Oxford who were arguing against Eyre and arguing against Ryle and arguing against all of this, saying that if this is all just a matter of language games that all people play, then we cannot speak ever in moral terms. This is wrong. I think that's the background to where I resist. I think as a historian, I always resist anyway. I'm going, what are they saying at a specific time and place? But I'd like to hear the arguments for universalism.
Well, so I'm not going to give an argument for saying, I mean, one has to define what you mean by universals. That's one thing. But I think there are one or two things that are particularly pertinent when we're reading very, very distant texts, because the temptation is always, as it were, to try on the hat and see if it fits. And this is a move towards a kind of universalism rather than looking at the hat and admiring it as it is in situ. And this is something which I think people who read early Chinese texts with philosophical intentions tend to do, that they say, well, this is something that everyone does. And you did a little bit of that yourself earlier, and it is very tempting, and it's very, very important in a sense that we, on the one hand, can see ourselves in these texts, because otherwise, why would we spend so much time doing this? But on the other hand, we also see that as it were, they're behaving in very different ways to us. So there is, I think, a deep interest in some form, if not of universality, in other words, a statement which is entirely without exception, which I think is probably asking too much of any non-mathematical or non-logical statement, but of statements with enormous generality. And of course, as one thing we were talking about earlier is the problem of ambiguity. So if the term ren is ambiguous, then and these people are not really paying attention to the ambiguity. They are assuming we can disambiguate, we readers, we recipients, but they're not pointing it out and making a big fuss about it, a la Socrates, or indeed a la Aristotle. They are assuming we can cope with the slipperiness of everyday language. And of course, that undermines universality very thoroughly, I think, because it shows that you aren't really interested in using what logicians would call a general term unambiguously in order to cover, as it were, a set completely. And so the question is, what are they doing? And you know, at the base of this question is, when we read these lines, what do we think that these lines are doing? Are they saying this is the case? Or are they saying this is the way you should think of yourself? Those are very crude alternatives, of course, and they're sort of, they're just to point out two possibilities. And I think a lot of it, I mean, certainly in the text, we sort of briefly discussed the Mencius 2a6 about the Siduan, has a lot about universals, which is meant to suggest, if you don't do this, then you're just not one of us. You're not behaving in the way in which one behaves, or one is.
Yes, and the whole point of the language of one is it's predicated on there's a very small group of people in the know who are sufficiently civilized, okay? One does not do that. Doesn't mean no people do that. It means people in our group do it. I'm going to begin with an observation from Stuart Hampshire. That the problem is that most people who are talking about political philosophy have never played a political role at all themselves, okay? Stuart Hampshire was a diplomat, and he knows whereof he speaks when he's talking about what is happening in texts that are not taking topics up for contemplative use, but are taking topics up to consider how to persuade others to act towards a common goal. And here I think of a line from Raymond Goyce, who says, we do not only wish to determine what is right to do, we wish to gain social approbation from others who look at what we're doing. Firstly, because if we don't have their approbation, it may impede our efforts, but more to the point, working together often strengthens our efforts. So I think this is what I've always despised the people who say China doesn't have any politics, any philosophy. because I thought this is the lowest common denominator. You define what philosophy is, and then you say these people are not one of us, okay? On the other hand, I think they have a point. We read philosophy in ways that are quite unformed about the driving questions. What are they trying to get people to do, and what sorts of arguments are they using to get them to do it? So for me, I think it's really, really important, if we're reading Mencius, to realize that no one ever saves the baby about to fall into the well. It is left for the reader to decide, would I save the baby? Okay, and it's left very much for others to contemplate. Would I let something intervene? And here I think we can gain something from modern behavioral scientists. I don't think we can gain much, but we can gain this. That in every study that's ever been done, we don't act the way we think we would act. We act the way we think people in our dung, in our group, would act. Mm-hmm. So if we think everyone's cheating on their income tax, we feel like a chump if we're not cheating on our income tax, unless we've been brought up very well to say, no, here's the guardrail. You just don't cheat. Okay. And so this is about putting in place some guardrails that give people a sense, under normal circumstances, you don't do X. But I can think of more, I cannot think of a single moral rule or principle that we don't routinely ignore. I don't lie in significant circumstances, but when I don't want to have dinner with someone, I say, oh, I'm so sorry, I have a previous engagement. I don't say, well, really, I don't find it particularly wonderful, the prospect of spending 2 or 3 hours with you. I mean, I just don't do it, okay? And I feel quite certain that if someone threatened the small group of beloved people, any of them, I would do my damn best to harm the person. And yet I subscribe to the overall message, do no harm. Okay, I try to act in that way, but I would sure as shooting in the crisis of the moment try to harm somebody. And I would have few regrets if I did so. Yeah.
So last night, a very great Kantian scholar gave us a very good talk about the fact of reason. And the fact of reason in the second critique has the function of telling us that we are all aware in a situation where we are called on to make a decision, that we are aware that the moral law has authority over us. And of course, this supposed fact of reason, I mean, it's a very tricky business, but this fact of reason has made a lot of people say, what fact? Because my consciousness doesn't tell me that when I'm making a decision. It tells me much less high-grade things. And of course, what you are, of course, saying here is that there are generalities with conditions attached.
With very grave conditions attached. Yeah.
Well, exactly. But I mean, so to go back to this question of what these people learn, of course, you do learn rules of some kind. And these rules do have generality, because otherwise your teaching would be completely inarticulate and would only consist in sitting on the mat and contemplating, which of course is not what happens and not what our texts do. So there is a very great deal of articulate bossing around and being bossed around, which is in a sense as it should be, but it also raises the extraordinarily difficult question, at least for me. I mean, it seems to me that I would have no idea how to run a state on the basis of what Mencius says. No idea at all. And it seems to me an open question as to whether anyone would have an idea about that.
Well, I think that's why you have broader consultation. But I think what you're bringing up at bottom is that rituals, which is often what you're trying to train someone in, habits of thinking, rituals are all communicative. That's what Herb Fingeret taught us. And one has to learn the rituals properly in order to know when one can drop the rituals. When I have my students to my house at dinner, no one is throwing food across the room, but no one is necessarily sitting in the same way you would sit at high table at college. So you need to know the rules, but the rules are all designed to communicate in specific settings rather than this is a general rule, do X. That's what ritual is all about, learning that. Sarah, you've been very patient. Yeah.
Thanks. I guess I was going to just ask something which maybe is probably slightly, I mean, it's tangentially related, but in the sense of the political philosophy element of this, which is that it feels like when you talk about this idea that you would directly, obviously, attempt to harm if someone was a threat, but then is there not an extent to which there are certain contexts in which we're asking of the state to be the hand that holds us back from the possibility of those actions that we would take by our own nature, like that the state is established as a means to stopping you jumping across the dock and doing as you would to somebody who had injured your somebody close to you that was injured, an injured party, right? So that the state is in some context, not obviously not necessarily the Chinese classical context, creating the space for operations that are not natural to us as individuals, acting in a person-to-person relationship, but that can be created and established. And in connection to that, I was going to say that at a point that I think that many of these questions about universals aren't necessarily about the, I mean, Kant would obviously appeal to the idea of a sensus communis, a basis for us making the claim that reason is universal.
Wait a minute, you're a woman, and Kant didn't include women.
I know, I don't agree that I have this. I don't agree that I have this. I agree that he would make this claim.
But not about us.
One could read Kant in the same way that you're reading the politicians, in the sense that Kant is getting us to do something with that, right? Kant is not just saying the starry sky above me and the moral law within. Kant's writing the moral law into people by establishing those ideas. And so what I'm saying is that there may not be a universal in the sense that we find it out there abstracted from us, but the appeal to the universal, the establishment of the idea of the universal, the reaching out towards, or like creating even a fictitious version of it, that's had power in many situations, including maybe the ones that you're referring to, but also situations like Kant making that claim to universality that people may look at and say, well, it's a problem because I'm not included in the common sense, although I might actually be included in the common sense if I'm a strict Kantian. Perhaps Kant wasn't strict enough in his Kantian ways. But
first of all, I think if we're going to talk about what Kant was trying to do, he was trying to imagine that we were all mini gods, and that is, of course, a bourgeois project at a particular point in time, which I would reject as being used against to bludgeon other people.
Yeah. But that's what I mean in saying that what he was doing.
Let's not talk anymore about Kant, okay? But there's a history to Kant, and I urge you all to read the book on German philosophy. This is not an innocent.
I understand that. I understand that. I've seen his categorization. So
let's get back to the heart of your question, okay?
Yeah.
So the heart of your question is this: I know of no state that doesn't say, and this would be true of small groups, that policing sometimes needs to be done. That goes without saying. And every single text in the early period imagines bad actors, even in the time of Yao and Shun, okay? I was just reading a Ming Dynasty text with a student where the time of Yao and Shun is literally perfect order. Well, not according to the text I'm reading. All kinds of things are happening. But the real question is, what are those institutions for? And I know of no case by any smart thinker about institutions that doesn't say that institutions, whether in the family, one doesn't do that, or in the larger society, are not also trying to nudge us in the direction of more fully socialized constructive behavior. So one doesn't eat peas with a knife. Doesn't mean no one does that. It means people like us don't do it. And I think states and societies are always identifying what is proper or improper behavior. What is true of the early period is not true of the later period in Chinese history, that you can have cases of 不孝. We would immediately translate that as unfilial, that are not between parent and child. What is true in the early period, but not later, is that women can marry themselves off the minute their husband has died, and they have the right to divorce and sometimes even take some of their children with them. This is unthinkable from late imperial China. So what I'm interested in is saying I'm not going to be able to understand the text in front of me if I don't know something about how the family is constructed in the period under discussion, and if I don't know something about how court is constructed. This is not, I think, a very high bar to ask people who assume these texts are therapeutic to actually know what the texts would have been talking about, or what they would have assumed when they're talking about the family or the court. So I'm not asking anybody to become a Han historian. There's plenty of stuff available in English if philosophers would try to read it. Okay. It's called academic silos, is what I'm talking about. Not how many of you in the recent past have I will not shame you by asking you to raise your hand, but I will say how many of you have read a good book on X that is about history of the period. Okay. So what I don't want people to do is to take texts, including the excavated texts, as disembodied, as not in the setting in which they exist and are circulating. That's not a very high bar. And the only people who wouldn't, I think, agree with that are people who believe in real universals, meaning there is a fact that we all have a sense of X. Okay. Well, I often don't. I have a screw loose. So anyway, I think, of course, we're talking what institutions are in place, what are the people who are putting these texts together assuming about the world they know? What do they think they can assume? And if we don't even make the attempt to learn what they think they can assume, boy, this is pretty pathetic, I think. Anyway, that I think is what I'm saying, that if I read about a historical figure who's interested, a leading figure in classical learning, I think I should read all of the texts that the person was reading. and see what his friends were saying and see what his allies. I don't think, especially in manuscript culture, which has huge numbers of variations as manuscripts are handed down from one person to the other, that I should take a single 4-character phrase, as is so often done, and say, and here I have the answer for you. Okay. So I'm saying people should be wider readers. People should be thinking more about what in the historical field we call historically trying to imagine or reconstruct. We know we're not doing it perfectly. That goes without saying. But we shouldn't imagine that the text is immediately going to speak to us in the way, I don't think that's being therapeutic, in other
Cool. Could you
words.
say something about the role of literature in that type of study?
Okay, so first of all, there's no difference between literature, science, history, philosophy, okay?
No.
These are texts that members of the governing elite command and compile, okay?
Yeah, no,
So
I meant
the
also.
modern academic disciplines, if you think, oh, I only have to read the philosophical texts, well, that just proves you're not even making an attempt to get from them the therapeutic insights that they hope they are offering. So how many philosophers have read Bohutom? Even in a not great translation, how many philosophers have really looked at Han histories to try to figure out what's going on? I think that if we want to get value out of the texts we're reading, we want to be certain of two things. We want to be certain that we find out from people we regard as authorities, well, what is the best translation of X if we're working from translations? And what are the commentaries we should be looking at? And this is why I think for me, Li Ziho is such an incredible figure. Because when you read Lunyu Jingdu in the way he's reading it, so that he's showing Han Dynasty thinkers aren't responding to the text in the same way that Song Dynasty or Ming Dynasty or Republican era people are responding, then you get two insights. The first insight is you better not be quoting a Song Dynasty commentary to understand what the text might have meant when it was written much closer to the time of unification. Okay. The second insight you get is all of these readings are legitimate. Classic texts spawn conversations. And those conversations we can learn a lot from. So it's extremely important, I think, that we don't delegitimize too early. But the minute I read somebody who claims, you know, oh, I know what the meaning of the text is on the first reading. Well, wow. I mean, I typically, if we're reading the Analects, have my students either read 5 or 6 different commentaries and say, how the hell did Ezra Pound come up with this? And how did Arthur Whaley come up with this? And how did D.C. Lau come up with this? And how did Roger Ames come up with this? And so we work on very few passages, but we try to think about the conversations that have been spawned by this. Or if we're doing a historical reading, then we're trying to keep ourselves to what are the likely readings from that time period. And sometimes each one of those activities is illuminating, but they're illuminating in a different way. So if you only stick to the Analects commentaries, then you might not have known. if you're reading Jushi, you might not have known that the Han Dynasty insists that one of the meanings of Ren is not asking people to do things they can't do. You would know that from Han Dynasty. So, Junyang.
Hi. Oh, thank you. So, yes, thank you, Michael. So, yes, I get what you're saying with the contextual reading, and I try to do that as far as possible in my research in Western philosophy and in Chinese philosophy. But I find that there are certain cultures, well, specifically the Indian literary tradition, whereby such an investigation might just be not possible, right? Whereby you have authors who are deliberately hiding their own authorial persona, or whereby you've got collections, right? Where they collections of subhashitas in which you'll have, you know, different verses that have authors. You have authors ascribed to these verses who are only ascribed to these verses to lend authority to these verses, right? Such that they were not really written by the authors to which they
Why
were
would you
ascribed.
think that's only true of India? It's totally
Oh,
true
no, I'm
of
not.
Chinese.
Yeah, I'm namely the one. Yeah,
So the
sorry. So,
Analects is transcribed in early Western Han. It
Mhm.
wasn't written down by Confucius and his circle, and we know that quite plainly. Nobody's quoting the Analects until a certain point in time. And so I think what you're saying is two things. First of all, the Sanskritist Sheldon Pollock would say, of course we have this problem. This is a historical problem. And there are many answers to which we can simply say, I do not know. If you're not willing sometimes to say that, I, for example, always tell my students, don't tell me what so-and-so believed, tell me what they transcribed. So Bangu, who knows what Bangu believes, but here is what Bangu puts down and puts his name on, okay? So I think this is a perennial human problem. I don't write out my first thoughts in an email. I edit those for better reception. I think that, of course, every tradition, this would be true of the Bible. There's a book called Jesus Through the Centuries, a very famous book by Pelikan, that shows that the Jesus of the Victorian era has nothing to do with the Jesus of the earliest time. So I take this for granted. So of course we live in a world of uncertainty, but we don't live in a world, there are some few facts on the ground. For example, we can say when certain texts were compiled, because we actually have Liu Shang saying, I compiled this from many manuscripts and here it is, and I'm slapping the name on it of this. And philosophers need to know that many of the texts they're reading are late Western Han compilations. So if you don't know that, then you're simply, it's not hard to find this out. And so that's instead what I'm arguing, not that we're arguing ever from certainty. I think that's the most important thing that Han Dynasty people knew. And I think they knew it thanks to Zhuangzi and thanks to other texts that they were reading, is there are no certainties in life. And that we do the best to operate within those constraints. So
Yeah,
of course we know that in oral cultures, names get slapped onto things, but that happens much, much later than oral cultures. Lu Wenchao, a Ming Dynasty exegete, people admired Lu Wenchao and they slapped his name on books that are clearly not Lu Wenchao. The same is true of Zheng Xuan. And all Zhengshuan experts know that. It's not very difficult to find it out. So that's what I'm telling you to do, is find out the basic facts about your book that can be known. And I wrote in an earlier piece in Martin Kern's edited volume on text and ritual, I regard each book as something like an archaeological core. And you may not be an expert in archaeology, so that may not mean much to you, but any archaeologist would know you take stuff out of the ground. You can only look at that sample. You don't know how representative that sample is of the rest of the site. If it's an important site, of course, you'll take 50 or 100 archaeological cores. But depending on how much time and money and effort can be spent on something, you may take one archaeological core and say, maybe I don't need to look further. But any archaeologist would say you need to look quite carefully at what you've got in that core, and then see what other information you can glean. And for an archaeologist, if it doesn't come from the core, it would come from similar type tombs, from judged to be of the same period. And sometimes there are debates over which tomb is dated to which period. And those are all things that you would need to know when you're thinking about the core. Does that make sense? So the fact of uncertainty, no historian thinks they're arriving at certainty. How could we know that? How could we know what is in someone else's mind when we can't even know what's in our own minds? So, yeah, I don't find that troubling.
No, I don't find that very troubling either. So what I really meant was, I think there are two kinds of, readings here, right? From a historical perspective, but what if the author had a deliberate intention to hide their own
okay, so you want to ask about esoteric transmissions.
Well,
they
not
do
necessarily.
exist.
Yeah.
Well, they do exist, but really most of the texts about which people like Don Harper would like to say this is an esoteric transmission. So for Taoism and Buddhism and pre-Taoist and Buddhist world, if it's esoteric, how the hell did we get the text? So there is no way these texts were esoteric at the time. These texts had to be circulated by enough people that they have survived for us. And so what I have gleaned from people like Christopher Skipper and others, Franciscus Varela, is, slapping the notion of esoteric transmission on a text that we have in our hands is a very risky business. Okay, it doesn't mean that a master cannot be sending messages only to his own students. It means that we don't have access to that anyway. So we can't worry about that. Our energies are misspent if we say, gee, I wonder what the master was saying to someone who's had 20 years of training with the master. We don't have those conditions of possibility. So why would we direct our energies in that way? I think that's what I'm really asking. Your life has a limit, but knowledge has none. Line from the Zhuangzi, okay? Things to know about have none, okay? So I think I'm suggesting that we direct our energies to what we can know better than we appear to be knowing.
Okay, thank you.
Makes sense? Sorry. Sarah, you're back up again.
Hi. Sorry. Yeah. I don't think I'm disagreeing with what you're saying here at all. So it's more of a sort of devil's advocate situation perhaps here. But I am just asking, insofar as you're saying, we recognize there's going to be a shard at some point. There's a limit to what's remaining there for us to discover, or for us to, excavate in terms of what remains of a past that is inaccessible to us in some perfect sense. So of course, as you mentioned, at what point do you start feeling comfortable talking about history for now?
Okay.
And the way that the historical becomes, because at what stage are you happy that you've traced enough excavation that you're not just going for more and more and more and more context to the point that you can't derive a lived history? And I assume, because you're saying there isn't a perfect, if there weren't a perfect link to the past, and I mean, I suppose Rosemont's written about this, and then Roger Ames often refers to it, and it's true of many of the, I suppose, philosophical readers of the Chinese tradition, that they may be doing some disservice to the history in having a take that doesn't take account enough of the contextual, but they are also doing something with a history. And maybe there are specific people that your critique is aimed at here, and I'd be interested to hear who they are in this field. But
Well,
I guess my question is, when are you happy to bring it into the now?
okay, I'm never happy on the basis of a single quotation. Okay. I'm very happy if I can see conversations across texts that are engaging in the same problem solving for the same problem. So this is what I make as a rule in history. And it's one reason why my poor students have beaten up out of them. You cannot use unprovenance texts as proof, but you can, when you see it in many, many texts, say, yes, they're concerned about this. And here's the answer that's come down to us in this text, and the answer that's come down to us in this text, and the answer that's come down to us in this text, okay? So that is, I think, how historians work. We believe that consciousness is sedimented, and that we can't talk about the person and whatever they're associated with without knowing the upbringing of the person, the cultural norms of the time, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a point at which I will become much more careful in claims. And I'll tell you what I'm really, Henry Rosemont was one of my mentors, and we were extremely close friends. And so I'm certainly, this is not targeted against Henry in any way, shape, or form. Here's what it is targeted against. People like Ted Slingerland and others who think that they can do statistical analyses of things at the time, and chastise people who don't do statistical analyses of things, and say instead things like, in general, we see, okay, or judging from the texts that are available now, one would think, okay. And why can't we do statistical analyses? Because we have about 1,000th of the texts we believe existed. Yeah. So anyone who is aware, and everyone who does philosophy should be aware of the arguments of how much is lost in every era. 80% of texts are completely lost from one dynasty catalog to the next. Okay, 80%. The numbers have been done on the catalogs of loss, and they're stunning figures. So we have almost none, for example, except for fragments of Han Dynasty commentaries. So you really have to work hard to do this. But there are people working hard to do this. So
yeah, of course.
That is the point. So Boxue, this is how they're compiling texts. This is how they get street cred in their own era for being amazing thinkers and compilers, they're able to use a wide range of rhetoric to make their points. And so I feel quite confident in saying, not that I know what Yang Sheng was thinking, but that I know how his group was operating at court. We have so many texts from that time period, and we know what were the driving their problems, you know, what problems were they seeking to solve? And so that's what I think we're losing by not seeing the historical circumstances of things. And I do think, I mean, I said to someone, and this is someone I respect, so I'm singling out this person in my mind for criticism, but I would prefer not to mention the name. I said, well, why did you use this translation of X? And she said, because it's the latest translation, I thought I would try it out. But her paper is all about the claims she was making on the basis of this translation. So I normally she does better work, and I think she got caught with very little time to do the paper. And so I put a veil of, we're operating behind an official veil of ignorance as to the identity of the person. Okay.
We'll all go hunting for it now.
No, you won't
I'm
find
joking.
the person.
I'm
So,
joking.
but the point, you get my point.
Yeah.
We all do things in better or less good ways, depending on how much time and effort we can spend on things. But I will often say to philosophers, well, did you even bother to go look at early Chinese texts? A piece by Michael Nylan that gives you the history of these texts as is known. And the answer is 90% of the time, what's early Chinese texts? So it's not like these answers are so unavailable. I'm not asking anybody, Lord knows, to become Michael Nylan. At times, I don't even want to be Michael Nylan. I'm asking people to do basic, what I would call due diligence. You wouldn't do work on Wittgenstein without knowing the time periods and the phases of Wittgenstein. You wouldn't do work on Hannah Arendt without knowing she evinced no interest in political philosophy till a certain point in the war years. You just wouldn't do it. So why is it that we think in Chinese studies, it's perfectly acceptable to do that?
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel very strongly, and I think that was a great question, and it was meant to allow me to speak very strongly about what I see. Yeah.
Thanks.
I wanted to return. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I thought one of the things that Sarah said earlier was quite helpful and interesting about the way in which universals might function. In that there's a way of speaking that alludes to, so it makes claims about the way things should be that are not the way things are. And those claims may be fictions, those claims may be, we may pretend that they're found in the order of nature, but ultimately it might not matter, right? That there's a sense in which that they function as a kind of regulative ideal, to not bring Kant back into this again. And in that, and there's a problem. I struggle with this as a hermeneutic problem, as you know, even when I'm wearing the historian's hat, insofar as the witnesses that we have for thinking about the time of Confucius are almost all polemical in their own right. So we don't have, we don't have the equivalent of, say, like the the economic data reporting that you would get if you were a 20th century historian, or if you're studying Wittgenstein, where you would say, you know, he was living in this particular village in wherever, and that, you know, the economic circumstances are such that, like, we have almost nothing like that for the. So what we do have are a bunch of people who despise the society in which they live and are making various kinds of claims about the way that society should function.
I don't agree with you at all. I think that you said despise the society in which they live. No, I think they wouldn't have bothered to be putting themselves on record if they did not think improvements could be introduced by people like themselves. I feel that very strongly. I think I've been very influenced by Marshall Sahlins, The Western Illusion of Human Nature, where he says, if you've been trained in certain traditions and you say, that's human nature, it means, well, that was reprehensible. And he said he's seldom gone to a place where you say, oh, that's human nature. It means that's reprehensible conduct, okay? So we see their critiques, sometimes incredibly sharp critiques. I read those as implicit trust that not that things are perfect, but that things can be improved. When I'm in a faculty meeting and I go way out of my way, often to offend my colleagues by saying, we have a problem here, it's because I believe that once the problem is identified, there will be at least enough people who say, yeah, maybe I need to think about this as a problem. So I don't think I see a single person to whom I can impute the motive that they despise. Why bother? You'd go then off to a mountaintop and be a recluse.
Well, yeah, let's not get stuck on the word despise. But the idea that, you know, well, I guess the point I want to make, or to push you on, is this question of what the nature of the language is that aims towards improving society. Like, is that language speaking about even, you know, I think that you're right, that there is a sort of trust that things can be better. I mean, the example that comes to mind that's so sort of pertinent for our context is the great, you know, I have a dream speech, which is that, you know, we were written this check that we intend to cash at some point, that all people are equal. You know, that
I really hate the monetary metaphor. But
that's his metaphor. I mean, it's that we were, you know, what's the precise language? I should have memorized this when I was in elementary school. But you know, that there was this that there's a promissory note, I think is the language that he uses, right? That all.
How about we have an implicit communal contract?
Yeah. But that reference to, like, sort of a trans-historical ideal about how things should function takes power because of its you know, trans-historical nature, like that we were owed this, our society doesn't live up to this, and we trust that the society can do better, and so we're holding the society to account based on its own ideals.
I think what you're saying is we were trained to value universals, and any feminist historian or feminist philosopher would know that we've been trained to value universals as having more weight than the more specific. That's the whole complaint about women, is that they deal in personals rather than universals. So I reject that. But what I would say is one of the stunning things about the Qin and Han is that they claim they're on an unprecedented experiment in how to devise societies until a certain point when they start claiming, mainly because they lack a great deal of power, that the way they've organized society goes back to Western Joe. Okay, so when you don't have certain kinds of power, and I think Patricia Crone mentions this, that the more you claim to be ruler of the stars, the more we should, as historians, be looking at, well, how much real power does this person have? Because people who are really powerful often don't, even in official proclamations, need to state this. So this is found in Patricia Crone's pre-industrial societies. And it's something I take to heart because maybe because I've lived through American politics in a political family, that the blowhards are always claiming, you know, I can declassify a document by simply willing it to be true. Okay. Whereas many powerful people in our society don't make any of those claims. In fact, are trying to shrink their profile so as to not get people to compete with them, not get jockeying for power. Because as the Swinza tells us, jockeying for power is dangerous, and they know it. Okay. So I think you're simply a function, despite the many sessions we've had together, thinking that a male universal is more authoritative than a female personal. And I still love it.
Add one tiny bit to that, which is that I'm not sure that you can say the claim that the personal is perennial is bad feminism, basically.
A perennial actually is quite different.
I think perennial is a useful way of thinking about this idea, though, like, and it's also a promise of the future as well, because the kind of thing Trenton's talking about is it's a vow, you know, it's a faith, and it's also the establishment, which is so crucial to many of these Chinese examples that we've been discussing. It's about the building of something that lasts as well. So it's got that sense of something growing into being as though like the monuments that look like they could last for all time, even though they may not be, they're able to, but they have a sublimely long look about them, even if they're not universal.
So if you look at Wan Shi, okay, and for 10,000 ages, but every good Han historian is taught the minute she learns classical Chinese that Yong doesn't mean eternal. It means long lasting.
Of course.
And so I don't see any problem. But when you look at where Wan Shi is used, and I have looked, it's in these very formal statements that what we aspire to doing is putting in place such a constructive set of models and institutions that between those two, these institutions will provide security. And what is security? Knowing that the community from which you come will continue to exist after your death. That means you will be sacrificed to if you're lucky, and certainly you'll be remembered. In the GE chapter of the Li Ji, it's not the sacrifices that make you continuous through time. It is the ability of people to imagine you and let you, in a sense, inhabit them. Okay. You bring them to full consciousness, you visualize them, all of this. They essentially take over your living body, and that feeds them. So I take these notions very, very seriously about continuity, and it's the chief thing that we leave out is time. Okay? And philosophers to my mind, don't deal with time in very productive ways because they don't quite take time seriously, because they're seeking universals. So time is effectively erased in many analyses. But I would say of every text I'm reading, they're arguing between a short-term benefit and a long-term good. And so is Derek Parfit in his piece about environmental. He's talking about, shall we go for depletion by not conserving versus shall we conserve resources? And each of those has consequences. So I'm not denying that people are asking about long lasting. I think good philosophers are speaking about this, but maybe not as much as good historians. But I can name you many people who are talking about time. Then I can name you many people who are saying we don't have to think environmentally because soon we'll be post-humans. And so we can't predicate any solutions on the fact that there will be people like us in 100 years. I think it's far more likely that we can't predicate anything about people 100 years from now because given global warming, we'll all be dead. But that's a likelihood, not a certainty. So I think that's what we're talking about. And that's why people are getting together to talk over issues in the period I'm working on. It's not because they don't think they're smart. It's that they think it takes a lot of people in collaborative efforts to figure something out. So that might be a good note to end on.
You didn't want to end on we're all going to be dead?
I prefer not to, mainly because I have people I care about who are 2, 3, 4, 6, and really I wonder what world we're giving to them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, well, I would thank you, but I think I don't want to drill too many holes in you, Michael. I don't have 70% certainty that you would survive this. So
I definitely wouldn't survive it.
yeah, so I mean, I think that I don't really want to, I think we all got together and had a good time.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
Kind of
Yeah, so I'm not going to thank you.
about 70%
Thanks,
of it.
thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, and I hope with all of us we'll continue to have these conversations because they make us all think harder about what we're claiming. And so as there are people who do social science research that say you never know something until you've talked about it in company with others. So you think you know something, but you don't really know it. And I believe that from what my limited island of experience, what I know is what I've talked about with others. Okay.
Wow, that could, Michael, that could be like the slogan for四海为学.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm going to write that down actually, right?
Been a pleasure.
Yeah.
So, and it's why I wrote the pleasure book, right?
Yeah.
My school friend from Kentucky said, "Oh, you're writing a self-help book." And I said, well, it is kind of a self-help book, but actually it's not a self-help book, you know. So anyway, I always channel Dorothy Day in a difficult situation and say the life you save may be your own, but it better be focused on saving someone else for the moment. So anyway, or trying to save for the moment someone else. Yeah. Anyway, thank you. I really had a great time. I'm now going off to my class on Carl Schmitt and Hannah Arendt, and getting snatches from listening to students, undergraduate students in the class and what they're asking. That's how I'm learning. So
It's a great way to learn.
thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks a lot.
thanks everyone. Yeah.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Many
Really,
thanks,
thank you.
everyone.
Great
Lovely.
fun.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.